I'd like to say a few words about the National Hockey League. We are currently developing guidelines that would allow Edmonton to be a hub city for the NHL playoffs. These guidelines have been developed to support players, NHL staff, media personnel, and Albertans to stay healthy and safe during such an event. We remain open to working with the NHL to address any concerns before these guidelines are finalized, whether that relates to quarantine requirements or any other matter. This will be completed in consideration of existing federal and provincial quarantine requirements that are in place for international travelers that may need to be addressed to accommodate the NHL's proposal. This could include further clarifying the concept of a group cohort for quarantine purposes that is currently in our guidelines, and how this could be incorporated into planning for practices and games. I know Premier Kenney has identified this as a matter that he wishes to resolve in the letter that he sent to the Prime Minister yesterday. Safety must be the top priority. In order to make this happen, all levels of government and the NHL will have to collaborate and find creative solutions. I have been in touch with my colleagues at the federal level to discuss this issue and how we can use cohort quarantine to ensure both public safety as well as safe practices and games for NHL teams. It's important to remember that if this event goes ahead, it would happen later in the summer. I know that many Albertans are anxious for some sporting events to begin much sooner. As I mentioned on Monday, I have heard the concerns and opinions expressed by Albertans, and we are currently exploring whether some sporting activities for all Albertans could be safely included in Stage 2. I will update Albertans when I know more. So I want to be clear that with respect to the quarantine rules, the guidelines that we have put in place that we feel would adequately address safety of Albertans, as well as being considerate of the opportunity for sporting events, which we know Albertans enjoy, to take place, that we think balances both of those interests. I want to be clear that we're not talking about waiving the quarantine requirements. In Alberta, the guidelines that we've put together that would need to be followed if the event were to happen here, what we've put together is an opportunity for a cohort quarantine, which would mean that a group that came in from international travel, such as an individual team, would have to stay together in that quarantine period and would not be able to interact with others outside of that cohort group. And as I mentioned, that size of that cohort group, whether it's one team or two teams that could potentially allow play, they would be effectively sealed off from the rest of the community, and there would be no interaction between them and the rest of the community, which, with respect to public safety, is the consideration that we take most seriously. With respect to the double standard with concerning other Albertans who might be coming in from international travel or those who wish to access arenas, as I mentioned, we are looking at including sports and access to recreational facilities under public health guidelines, potentially in Stage 2, which would likely be happening before, if this NHL event does come to Edmonton, that would be later in the summer. So I anticipate that Albertans will actually be able to access arenas depending on the decisions that are made, even before the NHL teams arrive, if they were to come here. And we do make exceptions under the quarantine provisions for essential service workers as long as they are allowed to follow certain criteria. So again, other Albertans who can meet very strict requirements are sometimes have an alternate version of quarantine that they work within in order to facilitate certain activities happening. So again, I don't believe that the alternate quarantine provisions put Albertans at risk at all, and I believe that the access to arenas is something that Albertans would be able to do. And if any sports team wishes to engage in competition and is able to abide by the sporting guidelines that we've put together for the NHL to consider, then the same guidelines would apply to them and the same kinds of considerations would apply to them as well. In the event of a positive test, then we would investigate, as we do any positive COVID case. We would determine who the close contacts were, and we would determine, what the time period was of the person who tested positive, what the time period was that they were potentially infective to others. who they were in close contact with at that time, and then make a determination about the quarantine requirements for those close contacts. I think that we would have to look very closely at the concept. You know, we're talking about the cohort quarantine concept for the international travel, incoming travelers, and so that potentially could be a consideration, but that's not something that we've discussed in detail. And ultimately, I would say that whoever is a close contact would have to be in quarantine. What that quarantine looks like, we could discuss.